what you are basically. Deep, deep down, far, far in, is simply the fabric and structure of existence itself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Parallel Mike podcast. I'm your host, Mike, and a huge thank you for joining me for the latest show. On tonight's episode, we do have a returning guest. He is my good friend and host of Palisades Gold Radio, Tom Bodrevics. Now, Tom is an expert when it comes to gold, silver, mining. He's also a very talented athlete and, all in all, a great guy, but also a very humble one, which is why I'm telling you these things now, because it's unlikely Tom will mention them himself once we get started. But if you have listened to Palisades Gold Radio before, you will know this already. Tom is one of the smartest hosts out there, so definitely excited for tonight's conversation. And of course, we're going to be getting into gold and precious metals and the changing monetary order, because you'll notice recently there's been lots of talk about gold again. The gold price is up 40% in just 12 months. And some people are even suggesting that we could see a huge gold revaluation under Donald Trump. Is it possible? Well, we're going to get into that and much more tonight. So without further ado, let's get to the episode. Members, please head over to parallelmike.com to sign in and listen to the full show. And if you're not a member yet, but you do enjoy part number 1, please consider coming over there to join us. It supports me and the content and gives you access to part number 2 of each and every episode. In closing, I hope you're all well, healthy, and reasonably happy. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Parallel Mike podcast. We're joined today by returning guest Tom Bodrevics, host of Palisades Gold Radio. Tom, you and I have had some great conversations over the past few years, some on the record, some off the record, but I couldn't think of anyone that I would rather have this conversation with. I wanted to talk about some of the big shifts that are happening right now in terms of geopolitics, finance, and especially with gold. We've seen a lot more interest in gold. Over the past 12 months, it is up 40% in the dollar and in most of the currencies too, and some huge narratives around gold right now. Now, one of those narratives, as we both know, is that 2,000 tons of gold has been shipped into the US over the past month or so, and this coincided with Donald Trump becoming president again. And some people are speculating that this is related to tariffs. That's the mainstream narrative. But there's many other theories too. We know Scott Bessent is a huge gold guy. There's talk of a gold revaluation to sort out the debt. So I'd love to get your take on this, Tom. And maybe you could just outline some of the theories around why this is happening, and then also give us your take as well.
Well, one thing that I make a big effort on the show is to try to stay away from sensationalism and to balance, let's say, the speculation with what we can actually point to as being confirmed. So for those that think I'm going to throw out some crazy numbers and stuff like that, you're going to be sorely disappointed. As you said, there's many different theories about why this much gold has moved back into, let's say, the US, whether that is to refill Fort Knox or to repatriate gold that has been promised. Like I've heard that it could be Germany's gold that they've been asking back from the US, and the US has this long lead time with which they're going to be able to deliver this, whether it's getting ahead of the tariffs. You know, that's an interesting one to me as well, because there's a lot of nuances to many of these arguments that aren't always discussed, and it's always this one story that we can present really quickly that isn't necessarily the full picture. So let's say there are going to be, for example, when Trump announced tariffs on 25% tariffs on Mexico. So if it was just a blanket tariff, this is the way I understand it. I'm not an expert on tariffs or anything like that, but if there's a 25% blanket tariff on any product coming out of Mexico, that would theoretically apply to silver, right? Now, that applies to the country of origin of that product. So if you're having silver come directly into, and I mean, we can apply this to any product for, let's say, any country that is being threatened with tariffs, and this can apply to gold as well. There is going to be a 25% premium. Now, the way that I understand it, once these tariffs are actually implemented, it doesn't necessarily serve the interest of the country placing those tariffs to specifically stifle the flow of silver for whatever reason, let's say. So there can be an exemption carved out for specific things like silver. Now, if that were the case and we had a clear path and a clear set of rules based upon here's what is going to happen, period, not we're going to go 25% and now it's going to be 10 and silver is excluded, now it's not, or whatever the case may be, which is what we have had at this point. It's tough to get overly excited about this from my perspective because we don't have anything concrete to go on. Now, the tariff thing, there are ways to get around that. Just like Russia has been able to sell plenty of energy to keep their economy floating, to keep themselves alive, the same thing can happen with using the example of silver. Mexican silver could be smelted down, taken to another country, cast as a different bar because it doesn't really matter. Silver is silver in a lot of ways. And you could mix it with, let's say, Argentinian silver or something like that. And that can still come into the US tariff free. So it's not that it doesn't add any cost, but it's probably a lot less than 25%. So, there are ways that the system will get around tariffs in some examples. And going back to the idea of gold, again, if it's just the country of origin, then that gold is going to flow to different countries and get used in different ways. And, it's almost like a shell game. Like if you were previously getting gold from here, country X is now subject to tariffs. Well, maybe that country is going to send their gold to country Y, and country Y is going to be getting or start sending more gold into the US if that is the case. The other part that I think that we don't know that is still speculation is this idea that it is private gold that is being brought into the US versus public gold. We don't know where those gold deliveries are actually going. By nature, the gold system is relatively opaque, just as many of these precious metals are, right? You don't want to show your hand. China is a perfect example of that, where many people point to China having a hell of a lot more gold reserves, both private and public, than what the official numbers suggest. So again, just this idea of understanding exactly what's happening is a major challenge. And I try to take a step back and look at this from a 50,000 foot view and look at the more historical trend of what's happening right now, who's actually buying the gold, and not getting so excited about, there's going to be a short squeeze and the shorts are going to get crushed and the bullion banks are going to go under and gold's going to go to the moon. That same narrative really exists for silver. And in my experience, that, granted, I haven't been doing this for 30 plus years, but in my experience, those narratives come and go and fizzle out. And that's not a good way to kind of base an investment strategy. You want to be taking a longer term view, with the idea that, I don't know the right way to word this, but for me, it's something like nothing comes easy. Nothing good comes easy. There are very few examples of people that are able to make millions of dollars in a short amount of time. And for myself and the place that I've come to really recognize, let's say, value and an investment that I really can get behind is something that has a historical track record that is also something tangible, right? We've seen this recent cryptocurrency hack where I can't remember the numbers. It was something like $1.5 billion equivalent of cryptocurrency just disappeared from people's wallets and this exchange. And again, I don't remember the specifics about it, but to me, having something tangible that is both in my possession and in a country and a storage system that I trust is a far more safe strategy to me.
Yeah, you bring up some really good points there, Tom. This is something we've seen throughout history. Even if you go back to the Cold War, you had many American companies literally with factories and warehouses in Soviet Russia, even though both sides were against one another and technically it was illegal. You had companies like Ford setting up factories in Russia itself, rebranding themselves and selling cars to the Russians. So when it comes to industry, when it comes to commodities, you do find that where there's a will, there's a way. I think recently as well, we saw this with Venezuela. They had lots of oil and the US put embargoes on it. So did the oil just sit there? No, it got sent across the world. It probably made its way to America even, and it just went through an intermediary country. So commodities always find a way. Great point that you made there, Tom.
There's a really interesting book that if people have the appetite for, it's called The World for Sale. And I think it's Javier Blas and somebody else. But that's a really interesting book that shows you these commodity traders and how these things actually happen, and the amount where there's a will, there's a way. In this book, where there are millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars to be made based on commodities, there is a way. So that book really proves your point about how commodities and money actually moves through the world.
Well, if we're aware of this, Tom, I'm pretty sure the Trump team and administration is aware of this. So does this give weight to the idea that something else is actually going on with this massive shipment of gold from Switzerland and London to the US? Because it does actually line up with another narrative that was brought to the fold, which is this narrative around the gold at Fort Knox. Now, for those that don't know, this is kind of folklore in the gold and silver space because the US supposedly has around 8,200 tons of gold. A lot of that is kept in a place called Fort Knox. Some of it is kept in a few other places too. But the US has notoriously been extremely evasive about auditing that gold, and many people are questioning whether the gold even exists. Has the US sold it? Has it been loaned out? Is it being used as collateral somewhere? We don't actually know, and to be fair, they haven't given us anything that proves the gold is there. Whenever they've delivered any kind of documentation on that gold, it was less than convincing. So we've had this narrative swimming around for about 30 years in the gold and silver space and in the financial media. But what we've never had is the president of the USA jump in on that narrative. I don't think either of us, Tom, expected to see Donald Trump casting doubts on the US's gold reserves. That would kind of be like a bank manager telling the world that maybe the bank doesn't have the reserves, which of course would be a catastrophe. It would lead to a run on the bank. So I guess the question, Tom, is why now? Why are they bringing this narrative up? Why does it coincide with the 2,000 tons of gold going to the US and the many other things we've seen around gold over the past 5 years, such as record levels of purchases by central banks and of course the price that just keeps going up, and that's because the currencies are going down. So what's the real narrative here, Tom? Give us your take.
Based on my analysis, I think Trump is happy to point to other people that have made mistakes. And because he has almost this way of absolving himself of any wrongdoing or any actual consequence, which, I mean, is great for him. Again, it makes the news cycle very, very dramatic and very chaotic. But I did a I did an interview on Friday with Jan Nieuwenhuis.
You did a pretty good job on that one, Tom. The first time I tried to pronounce that, it didn't come out quite so well.
Well, I do remember the first time interviewing him, thinking about it and asking him how to pronounce it. And I have, out of respect for my guests, I really try to make sure that I do pronounce their names right. And I literally, as soon as I knew that I was going to be interviewing him again, and I think this is like 3 years later or 4 years later, because the first time I had interviewed him, we were basically in our 1.0 version, and it was still audio only. So it must have been quite a while ago. And I still remember how to pronounce such a difficult name because of this obsession that I have. Whatever. Anyway, so on Friday, and if anybody wants to check that out, it's available on Palisades Gold Radio. And we walk through all of the problems with these Fort Knox gold audits. I've spoken to people on both sides, whether it be Jeffrey Christian that says there's no need for one, or somebody like Jan that says, here are the issues that I have researched, that I have taken the time to write 8 or 9 articles about. Here are the issues that I've found with it through submitting FOIA requests and through my own research. And there are glaring holes that come into this audit process as I understand it.
Yeah, sorry to interject just a second, Tom, but I just wanted to add for listeners that one of the audits that they did, they actually weighed the gold in ounces instead of troy ounces, which for anyone who knows precious metals would be a ridiculous mistake to make. It's certainly not something a professional auditing team would do. So that just gives you an indication of how amateurish these audits were.
Well, and there are other examples, like, obviously, and I can understand this from the other point of view as well, is like 8,000 tons of gold is, I think it's something like 40 million troy ounces or whatever the equivalent is. It's a hell of a lot of gold. And it's also stored in 3 or 4 different depositories, right? So it's actually a gigantic process. And as part of the process as well, we have to remember that there's a lot of like World War I, World War II era gold in there that is only, 90% pure. That doesn't actually, that's not really a marketable product if you were to actually want to sell it. Not that I'm saying that the US is going to be selling it or needs to sell it or anything like that, but.
And just for the benefit of listeners, Tom, can you tell us why that's so important? What the difference between a good for delivery bar is and these bars that the US potentially hold? They're not actually up to industry standard, are they? Which means they're not as liquid and they can't be used in the same way that gold bars coming out of London or the COMEX in New York could be used.
I think Jan brought up this idea of 1 kilo bars as well. But basically, there is a set standard that if you're going to put a serious amount of gold up for sale, that basically has to go through an exchange, because otherwise there's not going to be the appetite in, let's say, the private market for something like that, unless you can prove it. And it just seems like a way sketchier deal. And if you were to want to liquidate that amount of gold, you're not going to be able to do it just by putting like a Craigslist ad up kind of thing. So it needs to be of a certain standard to be able to deliver. So if you have a bar that is an odd weight that was made by Germany in 1935 or whatever it is, that's going to have a far less marketable value than a standardized good for delivery 400 ounce bar that everybody knows, that like a massive brick of gold that everybody can recognize. So there's certain purity specifications. I believe it's 3 nines on gold, 99.999% pure. And there are some of these bars that are, I believe, somewhere around only 90% pure. So it's you're dealing with impurities, and you're also dealing with chain of custody that doesn't necessarily fill people with confidence. That's why you buy things like maples or eagles, because they're easily recognizable.
I'm thinking back to those photos of the US soldiers with kind of a truckload of these dodgy looking gold bars that came out of Iraq. And then there was Libya apparently too. And yeah, you can't just put those on the global market. They would have to be properly refined and checked. And if the US does have some dodgy gold, I guess for the largest, one of the largest economies in the world and the global hegemon that has the dollar, the global reserve currency, you'd think that they would want to get those bars up to scratch and have a proper audit and make sure that everything in there was at the correct standard, right? It just seems like a given that they would want to do that, but they haven't done it yet.
See, and I actually disagree with that, because if they're not looking to monetize it, if they're not looking to actually get rid of any of it, which at this point, we don't see the need for that, or I don't see the need for it, it's also an expensive process. So if you have an exploding debt, if you have an exploding national debt, then why would you add more cost to refine this gold because you don't want to sell it? Like, there doesn't seem to be the need for that in my mind. And just going back to the second part of what I was, one of the issues that I was going to bring up with the gold audit as well, they went into a couple of these rooms, audited what was in there, audited the weight and the purity of what was in there, and then placed a permanent seal on some of these vault rooms. And then they went back within 10 years and they reopened and recounted those vault rooms when that was supposed to stay closed. And that it's like that part of the audit was done, but we're going to recount it anyway. So it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense and doesn't fill you with confidence. I completely understand the other side of the argument as well, that says we have audited this gold once, and if there is a permanent seal placed on that room, there's no need to go back and actually count every individual bar and spend the physical time to go through each room and recount everything if we can just place a seal on the door and audit the seal, right? So the other part of this, to me, that is the big unknown factor as well, and that's part of the speculation, is if some of this gold has been leased out or encumbered in some other way, meaning it is being promised and or bought by a third party or whoever it might be, and in essence almost lent out as a non-backed asset, like almost a reserve based system, which isn't going to be good either, right? There's a lot of speculation around that, and nobody can know for sure at this point in the public, let's say, who has claims, or if there are more than one claim to much of this gold. And I don't think there's any way to really know that, because again, this is just such an opaque system. That being said, I would understand that there is the possibility of that happening, but the likelihood of that happening, I don't think it's non-zero, but I also don't think it's as high as some people make it out to be.
Really good points there, Tom. And one thing that I certainly agree on is, why would you go through the trouble of counting all the bars, refining them again? I mean, this audit alone could take 2 years, right?
It would take a large team and a well set up team 2 years to do.
So if they show up with Donald Trump and Elon Musk and we get some pantomime of them at the audit and they say, oh yeah, we looked and it was there, that's nothing. That's no audit. It would have to be professional, kind of like Tether's reserves, right? They always say, have we audited Tether's reserves? And they never audit them. They just give you a piece of paper that says, we promise it's there. This doesn't cut it. When it comes to an audit, you need something that is absolutely concrete, where you have a professional team go in, they understand the difference between troy ounces and ounces, and they measure every bar. And then if they wanted to go through the process of actually getting them up to standard so they could be put onto the international market at any time, they could pull the trigger on that. You're talking years. Like that would mean shipping it all the way across, probably to Switzerland and back again. It's a huge operation, a military operation. So having said all of that, we have both watched over the past decade, and especially the last, I would say, 5-6 years, gold quietly returned to the financial system. It started with China and Russia post 2008. And then Europe started to accumulate a lot as well. The country I'm in has increased their gold holdings from around, I think it was around 30 tons to 450, I want to say, at present. And that's kind of pan-European. The countries that had no gold have got their gold reserves up to around 4% of GDP. And it seems to be almost like an unofficial agreement, at least 4% of GDP. And as we zoom out, and we both like to take that 10,000 foot view, or you actually said 50,000 foot. So you go higher than me, Tom. I'm the 10,000, you're 50, but we're kind of looking down on it all. And we know that these debt-based systems don't last forever. At some point, they're going to unravel, spiral out of control. Usually when the debt expansion stalls or the interest payments just get so high that a nation can no longer afford to pay them. And the US, at present, it's paying 30% of its expenditure just on interest payments alone. It's more than defense now. And bearing in mind, the US has a defense budget that's the next 10 countries combined. So it's huge. And meanwhile, we do have this global instability. We've seen wars in Europe again. We've got trade wars happening. Resource wars are beginning. And now we're starting to see potentially Trump making moves on other countries that have resources, whether it's just for show and whether it's just theatre. I don't know. I'm not so sure. They have just bought, or at least BlackRock has just bought some ports on the Panama Canal, which is something that Trump said he wanted to do. So could this, Tom, could this be the moment that we actually start to see some fruition on this gold narrative, that they are going to somehow remonetize it or put it back in the system? Does it link together with these past events and this kind of evolution of gold coming back, or is there something else going on? I just want to put it out there that could it be a part of some kind of strategy to reset the financial system or have some kind of evolution from the petrodollar that looks to me like is going to happen, because Scott Bessent and Trump are talking about the 3-3-3 plan and this idea that they're going to devalue the dollar and increase exports, and all of those things would really be a new system. So would gold fit into this, in your opinion?
I think gold definitely fits into it. The idea that I can say with any authority that this is what's going to happen, absolutely not. I think these things take much longer to play out than anybody expects. And the way that I approach this is by trying to be prepared for any one of these outcomes. And what I mean by that is understanding, just for example, looking at the price of gold over the past 5 years, for example. Even the past year, I think it's up from like $2,100 to $2,900. Like, where else are you getting, if you're actually selling it at this point, where else are you getting that kind of appreciation or return for that little amount of risk? Owning physical gold is something that makes a lot of sense when you consider the players that are buying it hand over fist, that are stacking it, and that do already own it, and what that asset means to their balance sheets. You know, thinking about trying to become your own central bank is, I think, a good way of looking at this. And going back to your question about what is actually going to take place, again, I don't think anybody has the perfect answer to that. We've seen a lot of noise and energy put into Enbridge. We've seen a lot of noise and energy put into this idea of the BRICS alternative currency. And then Trump, I think it was before he was actually sworn in, said that if anybody is not going to be using the US dollar, they're going to basically pay for it. And the US dollar has to stay as the reserve currency. I definitely think we are headed, at very least, to much more of a multipolar world. At this point, I don't see outright war serving any of the interests of any of these countries at this point. I think, smoldering proxy wars are far more suitable or suited to the aims of the parties that are interested at this point. But again, going back to this idea of what could happen, I think there's 5 to 10 possibilities of how this ends up playing out. And the only way that I see to be prepared for any of those outcomes, because again, we don't know exactly how this is going to play out, is to become far more of your own central bank. Gold is obviously going to be a piece of many of these systems because, again, you just have to look at the symptoms. Look at how much gold China has been buying over the last 2 years. Look at how much gold Poland has been buying. Any of these, or let's say not any, but a number of these European central banks, any of these central banks around the world, whether that be Russia, whether it be China, whether it be Poland, Hungary, all of these different central banks. And I think to me, the real clincher is to have gold re-enter the zeitgeist or the narrative in the West, because in the East, people have a completely different attitude and value on gold. It's not something that is forgotten about, that is looked upon with, in a lot of ways, looked upon with resentment almost, because you've had Bitcoin and Dogecoin and Fartcoin and all these other bullshit mediums of exchange, let's call them, or speculations, I think is a better word. You've had all of these different asset classes be far more exciting and speculative than gold, and yet gold is now re-entering the public consciousness. And all you have to do is look at the outperformance of gold, and is it going to do what Bitcoin did? No, but that's also the beauty of it. Am I saying that you should put all of your money into gold? Absolutely not. I think that would be completely irresponsible. I very much try to take the attitude that we should constantly be questioning every one of our feelings about any asset class, and make sure that we are trying to be accurate about how we're analyzing any of these things. Like, do I wish I would have taken $1,000 and thrown it at Bitcoin back when I found out about Bitcoin? 100% yes. But that doesn't mean that I put my life savings in Bitcoin and like Michael Saylor says, sold my house to buy Bitcoin and did all, like, sold myself to buy Bitcoin. I think that's completely irresponsible, but I also try to stay as open-minded as I can for room to speculate with a small amount of my net worth. But again, going back to that idea of being prepared for the largest number of outcomes that are possible, being in some cash, being in a decent amount of physical gold covers a hell of a lot of your bases.
Yeah, it does. And I think the longer you own gold, the more you really get to understand what it is. When I first bought gold, I thought it was an investment, and I saw it much like I saw stocks or bonds, but I thought maybe it's safer because it's a tangible asset, there's no counterparty risk, and the financial system looks dodgy. But I still saw it as an investment. But the longer I studied gold and went through the history, the monetary history, I realized that JP Morgan was right when he said that gold is money and everything else is credit. Everything else has counterparties. Everything else is based on debt. And therefore, if the debt system collapses, those assets collapse too. Whereas gold, being real money, will have to actually go up to account for all of that. And it will buy you a lot more stuff because those prices go down, but gold doesn't have debt attached to it. It is actually money. So once you understand that, you say, okay, I get it. I understand why gold doesn't go up like Bitcoin and it doesn't go up like Nvidia's stock. It's not meant to. It's simply meant to protect your purchasing power. And when that debt system fails, of course, then gold has to account for all of the assets that exist. And if they're going to reset the system, they're going to have to find a way of using gold and getting it to account as money for all of the debt they've created. And to do that, you'd have to see a gold price far, far higher than where we are now, We're talking $30,000 per ounce, $40,000 per ounce. And that's what people are discussing right now, that they're going to have to reset the system at some point. Gold is the way they've always done it. And it's looking, based on all the things that we're seeing, like it's going to be gold again. Now, I would never suggest to people that you own gold for those reasons. I think the reason you should own gold is because it preserves and protects your wealth and there's no counterparty risk. However, during times of history like this, where there is a massive debt burden and you know there's going to have to be some reckoning, well, that might make you want to own more gold because you can see the historical patterns here and you realize that at some point we could see housing collapse 80-90% versus gold, the stock market collapse 80-90% versus gold, and therefore it would buy you a lot more stuff. But that's not really the main base case of using gold, is it, Tom? It's to protect your wealth, it's to preserve it, and to give you just some honesty in a system that is completely dishonest.
I saw this silly meme the other day, but I think it really it illustrates the point that it's starting to gain a lot more attention and mainstream attention, and that being, this idea of how much debt. And it was, again, this dumb meme that I saw that said, who the hell do we owe? Or the world is something like $100 trillion in debt. And it's like, who do we owe? Like another planet, right? And it's a silly thing if you actually understand what's going on. But this idea that it's starting to enter mainstream consciousness, I think is really important. And I would caution people that think that this reset is inevitable. For those of us that have paid attention to this system before 2008, there's a lot of people that thought and warned, and there's even more people that said, like, this is it. This is the end of the system. This is the end of the road. There's no possible way the system can continue as is past this point. And we're in 2025 and my credit card still works, or my debit card, or whatever it is, right? We're still in that same fractional reserve system. So thinking that this is inevitable tomorrow, again, I really caution people to question that. Is it going to happen at some point? Absolutely. But that point is probably a lot further down the road than a lot of people think. Now, that being said, I do have the luxury of speaking to many very, very intelligent people. And there seems to be kind of a consensus at this point that there is some type of a reset and some type of very hard times coming in this, let's say, in this next decade, in 10 years, within 10 years of now. What that looks like, again, nobody can actually tell me for sure what's going to happen with any degree of authority, I think. And unfortunately, I don't think anybody knows for sure. And, going back to that idea of let's say maybe picking up the breadcrumbs and using those as clues as to what is going to be part of the system, I think gold is inevitably going to be part of many of these different systems, whether it is revalued to $50,000 an ounce to deal with this debt. I think it's really important to understand and remember that these debt-based systems can be kicked down the road for far longer than any of us can imagine. 2008, 2020, there's so many of these examples where a lot of people thought that was the end of the road. And yet there are ways that the central banks have figured out to be able to inject liquidity into the system to keep it rolling. A lot of the system is just about liquidity and the ability for capital to move seamlessly. It's not necessarily that these zombie companies are actually worth something now. It's not necessarily that we have entered this MMT era and everything is different, or that country size economies function differently than a household economy in a way, right? Having more debt than you can actually pay. In a way that is a little bit different if you can print the currency. But again, I just really want to remind people that these systems can propagate for a lot longer than any of us think that they're going to be able to, with the caveat that at some point this is going to come to an end, right? This is going to come to a head. And what that head looks like, nobody knows. And again, I think gold covers a lot of the bases, and at least, not trying to make any of these price predictions, but rather understanding that this asset, this tangible asset, is a way to take this energy equivalent value and transfer it through time, through systems, through these hard times. There are so many people that recognize the value of gold, and to a lesser extent, let's say silver, through these systems, and thinking about the actual energy equivalent value or energy equivalent store of gold, I think is an interesting way to think about it as well, because that is basically a way to transport the value of the labor and energy that was put into mining that piece of metal. And that, in a lot of ways, gold is way too expensive to use for basically any other purpose, which makes it perfectly suited to be used as money. And there's always that distinction to be made between money and currency.
Yeah, you again, Tom, you make really great points. And these are points that people sometimes they just need to hear laid out correctly, because, I've had people say to me, well, they're going to go to a system that's backed just by digital assets. It's going to be a Bitcoin backed system or XRP or whatever it is that people put out there. And I say, well, that would never make sense to a central bank. You couldn't have your entire set of reserves based upon something that could be destroyed by quantum computing that maybe you don't possess, but China do. And now all of a sudden they can just destroy a nation's reserves, or there's some kind of power outage or a solar flare. You always need physical, tangible wealth for those reasons, because you can't depend on something that could actually be hacked or reset or destroyed. And of course, this goes for you too and your wealth. You don't want 90, 95, 100% of your net worth in things that could disappear overnight. You've got to really think that tangible wealth is always going to be absolutely vital to the system. And I'd say it's never been more vital, because there's so much that is digital that if that goes wrong, and we know it can go wrong, it does go wrong all of the time, then you need a backstop, you need a foundation. And I think that's where gold comes in.
What I was going to say, I do think there's a lot of room in these systems to make them more efficient, to make them, why does the SWIFT system take days upon days to actually transfer more than $10,000, let's say? Yeah, it's a form of control. Yeah, it's a form of gatekeeping, but it's also, if we were to step back and actually try to improve the system and make currency and money, improve it to the point that everything else seems to be in this world, digital and instant, then, there are huge ways that these systems can be improved. Whether that is in the interest of the system, that's a completely separate question.
I agree with that. And this is sometimes one of the criticisms people make. Nobody's talking about carrying around lumps of metal and going to a coffee shop and slapping it down on the table and having to file off little bits to pay the right amount. Nobody's talking about that. You could certainly have a digital system, a digitized system that has a real asset underlying it. And of course, it will get corrupted over time. They always do. But that's not the point. The point is you could have a system where you could have an exchangeable digital token that you could at any point exchange for gold and silver. And if you didn't trust the system, then you'd go and do a run on the gold and silver. You'd take it out. So there's certainly many ways that this could evolve in the modern world to give people more privacy, more autonomy, and some tangible wealth. But as you rightly pointed out, Tom, they're not looking to give us more liberty. They want to track us. They want to surveil us. I don't think they want us to have that unicorn system that we just described.
It doesn't serve the incentives of the existing, let's say, shareholders and or systems. And, a lot of people think that just because I'm very focused on gold, that means I'm against cryptocurrencies. I'm not. Like I really believe in the spirit of what cryptocurrencies are all about. Like the idea that I can transfer you a couple $1,000s almost instantly for fractions of a penny. I think that is a completely revolutionary and necessary evolution in money. But then we have to add this other layer in of like actually storing wealth in something like that. That part is where all of the questions come up to me. Again, to me, to actually store wealth in a cryptocurrency and to have it appreciate, that to me is still a speculation. And that doesn't mean that it's not a really good medium of exchange or way to transfer value across borders. But I want to go back to this idea that we were kind of talking about. You mentioned instead of having, let's say, owning physical silver, to speculate on some silver miners.
Yeah, this was before we hit the record button, Tom, but we was just talking about how we can get exposure to the gold and silver price and actually more volatility with things like gold miners and silver miners. You can buy shares in those companies. So you don't just have to have physical metals. You can actually do other things too. There's many ways to structure this and to try and get leverage to these prices. And sometimes it makes more sense to actually add some volatility to your portfolio. So I'll hand it back to you, Tom.
The point I wanted to bring up about this is just more so thinking about and being far more deliberate about actually building a portfolio that you're deliberate about. And that means having, this base layer of a savings account, if you will, of physical gold, and or, maybe that even looks like a farm or a piece of land that you are comfortable with the jurisdiction that it's in, that you can feed your family with, right? Like that is a very tangible asset that serves to make you very, very wealthy, right? That gives you resourcefulness and self-reliance, which those are two topics like I'm sure we can really, really dive into, but we don't need to at this point. And just going back to this idea of being deliberate about having a well-constructed and well-balanced portfolio. A lot of people, I think, need to put a lot more thought into that. Having this base layer of physical, tangible wealth, that doesn't account for 90% of your net worth, right? You need some liquidity, you need some safety, you need some speculation. That looks different for every single person, just as every single person's needs and requirements are completely different. But going back to this idea of risk tolerance, of trying to transport some amount of value at some point, whatever point that might be, from one system to another, and or having convertibility from one dominant system into an emergence of new systems, that gives you the most amount of flexibility and optionality. And that's what this time is all about, is having flexibility and optionality and not being backed into one particular corner where, just like in Europe, they're really going after. I saw a thing this morning, I didn't have time to really dig into it, but this implementation of a CBDC in Europe, like if you are subject to that because of your lack of foresight, that's really going to suck. And you're going to be forced into that situation, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, it would be game over at that point, Tom. Once they take away the physical representation of value of money and they go to a purely digital system, then you are a slave. And it even makes you appreciate fiat money compared to that, because at least you've got some semblance of privacy and some way of transmitting value outside of this digitized system. But I think that's a really good place to cut off for part number one, Tom. And my closing thoughts on this for part number one is things are changing fast. We clearly are going through some evolution of the system. Gold is certainly The barometer is flashing warning signs that something's happening. The gold price going up 40% in a single year are things you should be taking notice of. We don't know how it turns out, but what we saw recently with the US now importing lots of gold and these narratives around Fort Knox, I think these to me are the warning signs of the things that people like you and I, Tom, have been speaking about for many, many years. And maybe we are getting to that point now where something big is going to happen. But I would say just ensure that you are set up to protect yourself and your family's wealth going into whatever happens next, which could be something unlike anything we've seen in our lifetimes. Now, going into part number 2, Tom, we're going to shift gears a little bit. We're going to talk about some of our favorite things to discuss, which is how do we keep ourselves practically, mentally prepared. And I know you've got a new podcast coming out where you're going to be discussing those topics with your guests. So I'm really excited to talk about that. I want to mention that book that you suggested to me a while back and share that with listeners. So lots to get into, Tom. And, I'm going to edit that point in the conversation where you mentioned $50,000 gold, and I'm just going to play it on loop at the start. No, I'm joking. One more time, Tom, a big thank you for joining us. And please tell listeners where they can find you and your content, and I'll put all of the links in the description.
Anywhere and everywhere you want to listen to it, basically. Palisades Gold Radio, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on X as well at Palisades Gold Radio.
Okay, listeners, that's it for part number 1, but we've got a lot more to come in part number 2. So if you are not a member yet, please consider coming over to parallelmike.com to join us to listen to the full show. Also, if you would like some support around gold, silver, wealth preservation, and getting yourself ready for whatever comes next, I am available for one-to-one wealth preservation consultations. You can find out more information on the website. In closing, thank you so much for listening. I hope you're all well and healthy. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in part number 2.
What you are basically. Deep, deep down, far, far in, is simply the fabric and structure of existence itself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
Within man, not one man nor a group of men, but in all men, in you the people have the power.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.